Okay, it's cast in four folio volumes. The New Testament was also separately edited by Tischendorf in smaller type in Quarto, Leipzig, 1863, in 4 columns and so forth. And this codex is the most complete, and also with the exception perhaps of the Vatican manuscripts, the oldest, or at all events one of the 2 oldest manuscripts, although it was last found and used. This is be a Greek manuscript, right? Tischendorf calls it, and it's all in Latin here, he assigns it to the age of Eusebius, the historian, who died in 340, and thinks it not improbable that it was one of the 50 copies which Constantine had ordered to be prepared for the churches of Constantinople in 331, and that it was sent by the Emperor Justinian to the convent of Mount Sinai, which he founded. And here's here Tischendorf's edition of the English New Testament, Leipzig, 1869, page 12. After a more careful inspection of the Vatican manuscript in 1866, he had somewhat modified his view of the priority of the Sinaitic over the Vatican manuscript, and assigns him both to the middle of the 4th century, maintaining even that one of the scribes of who wrote 6 leaves and who designates D, wrote the New Testament part of B. It's just talking about codices. Compare the learned and very able essay of Dr. Ezra Abbott against Mr. Burgon, Comparative Antiquity of the Sinaitic and Vatican Manuscripts, in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, Volume 10, 1872, paragraph 189 to 200. Gebhardt in Herzog's Real Encyclopedia, New Edition, Volume 2, page 414, pronounces Burgon's attempt to prove the higher antiquity of the Vatican manuscript by 50 to 100 years as an entire failure. Okay, this manuscript, Codex X we call it, right? It's got that funny symbol there, contains large portions of the Old Testament in the Septuagint version, 199 leaves, and the whole New Testament without any omission, anything left out of it or taken out of it, removed from it, together with the Epistle of Barnabas, all in Greek. So is that Epistle of Barnabas supposedly that letters of Pilate or something like that? All in Greek. And a part of the Pastor Hermai in Greek, 147.5 leaves. It is so much disfigured by numerous corrections made by the original scribes or several later writers, especially one in the 4th century, whose emendations are very valuable, and one of the 7th. It often confirms Codex Vaticanus in characteristic readings, and it has all this information here. And it has contributed very much towards the settlement of the text and stimulated the progress of the revision movement in England, in connection with Tischendorf's Tauschnick's edition of King James Version 1869, which gives in footnotes the chief readings of the 3 great uncials. Is that symbol again? And B and A. Must be the codexes. Tischendorf first copied the Sinaitic manuscript with the help of Coptic scribes at Cairo, and from this copy which the professor showed Schaff at Leipzig, the printed editions were prepared, as neither Tischendorf nor his scribes were infallible. Some errors may have crept in, so they were susceptible to making errors, right? Mistakes, copying mistakes, etc. Some errors may have crept in, so that in doubtful cases a resort to the original manuscript in St. Petersburg is necessary. Tregales has inspected it. Considerable portions of it have been photographed, and real facsimiles are given in Tischendorf's 3 editions and in Scrivener's introduction. Mr. Burgon, also in his book on the last 12 verses of Mark, gives an exact facsimile of a page taken at St. Petersburg, which shows the last 2 columns of Mark to 16:8, Mark 16:8, and the first columns of Luke, and here it's in the Greek. It's a specimen of the Codex Sinaiticus containing 1 Timothy 3:16, and here it is in the Greek. And it goes on about Codex Alexandrinus of the 5th century. And Codex A, the first uncial manuscript that was used by textual critics. It presents a text which occupies an intermediate position between the oldest uncial and the later text. And Codex Vaticanus of the middle of the 4th century on very fine thin vellum, in small but clear and neat uncial letters in 3 columns of 42 lines each, to a quarto page, 10 inches, etc., etc. And some more specimens of the Codex Alexandrinus. And the Sinaitic manuscript, but not so complete. Okay, that's all this information here. And it carries on in that style, giving all this information in the Greek. And she's something about the text of Codex Bezae or Cantabrigiensis in the library of the University of Cambridge, to which Beza presented it in 1581. It dates from the 6th century and contains only the Gospels and Acts, with a Latin version edited by Thomas Kipling, Cambridge 1793. 2 volumes, folio, and more accurately by Dr. Scrivener in common type with a copious introduction and critical notes, Cambridge 1864. The text is very peculiar and puzzling. It has many bold and extensive interpolations, for example a paragraph after Luke 6:4, which is found nowhere else. On the same day he, Jesus, beheld a certain man working on the Sabbath, and said unto him, Man, blessed art thou if thou knowest what you've done, or what you're doing. But if you don't know, you are cursed and a transgressor of the law. It differs more than any other from the received Greek text, but maybe that's the Textus Receptus, but it often agrees in remarkable readings with the ancient Latin and Syriac versions. Alfred, it's got maybe issue 110, or it's got I there, 110, thinks that it was written in France by a Latin transcriber ignorant of Greek. Beza procured it from the monastery of St. Irenaeus at Lyons in 1562, but did not use it on account of its many departures from other manuscripts. Tregelles remarks that its evidence, when alone, especially in editions, is of scarcely any value as to the genuine text, but of the very greatest when corroborated by other very ancient authority. 2. Uncials of the 2nd class, defective and of later date. D. For the Pauline epistles, Codex Claromontanus of the 6th century, defective but very valuable, in the National Library at Paris, edited by Tischendorf, Leipzig, 1852. Beza procured it from Clermont and made some use of it, 1582. It is Greek and Latin, stichometric, with accents by a later hand, but no division of words. E. For the Gospels, Codex Basilensis, 8th century, in the library at Basilic, defective in Luke. Erasmus overlooked it. Collated by Tischendorf, 1843. Müller and Tregelles, 1846. It is better than most of the 2nd class uncials. It approaches to the Textus Receptus. E. For the Acts, Codex Laudianus in Oxford, with a close Latin version on the left column, of the 6th century, probably brought from Tarsus to England by Theodore of Canterbury, died 1690, and used by the Venerable Beda, died 735. And it's got all this information, these different manuscripts, etc., and what century they belong to, and so forth. The ancient versions. Next to the study of the manuscripts, the most important aids in textual criticism are the ancient versions or translations of the scriptures from the Hebrew and Greek into vernacular languages. It's probably a more modern form or translation. They are, however, only indirect sources, as we must translate them back into the original, except in omissions and additions which are apparent at once. And it goes on about that. While the interpreter of the New Testament will be fully justified in setting aside without scruple the authority of early versions, there are sometimes ambiguous passages in which a version may preserve the traditional sense. John 1:39, 8:25, etc., and so forth. It matters comparatively little whether they be elegant or wretched, so long as they reflect with accuracy the original text. One service of great importance they can be manifestly depended upon to render, to tell where insertions or omissions occur in the original text before the translator. It is therefore satisfactory evidence against the genuineness of any particular passage that it is not found in the most ancient versions. The most important of these versions are the Syriac, the Old Latin, the Vulgate, the Ethiopic, the Egyptian, the Gothic, and the Armenian. A. Syriac versions. A. The Peshitta, the simple, so called because of its fidelity to the Greek, dates in its old form, see below, Curetonian, from the middle of the 2nd century. It supplied the wants of the Syrian Christians before the unhappy schism in that church, 5th century, and by its use in common has always been a bond of union between the different sects, who still read it as a sacred classic, although its language is no longer the vernacular. So it's not this derivative or this modern language. It's probably gone back to its supposed original. The Peshitta is the most faithful and accurate of the older versions, and has been called the Queen of Versions. Yet this mentor translator Victor N. Alexander was told by a priest of the Apostolic Church of the East Restored that they don't use it because it's botched. And maybe what they had was a botched version. They don't like it. Even Andrew Gabriel Roth at the AramacScriptures.com, he avoided it as well, and the Latin versions and so forth. It is almost literal yet idiomatic and really loose and paraphrastic. It is very important to the critic. The text connects it in many places with Codex D and the Latin versions. Notwithstanding its age and value, it was not known to Europe until 1552, and in 1555 at Vienna the first edition appeared at the expense of the Emperor Ferdinand I, edited by Albert Widmanstadt, the Imperial Chancellor. This edition is yet highly esteemed. The best modern editions, although none are superior, are those of Professor Lee, printed by the British and Foreign Bible Society, and of William Greenfield and Baxter's Polyglot, and separately. The peculiarity of the Peshitta version, and a proof of its early date, is its omission of 2 Peter 2 and 3 John, Jude, and the Apocalypse. Dr. Murdoch has published a literal translation from the Syriac Peshitta version, New York, 1851. A translation of the Acts and Epistles from the Peshitta by J. W. Etheridge appeared in London, 1849. B. The Philoxenian or Heraclean version, so called from its patron Philoxenus, Monophysite, Bishop of Marburg, Hierapolis in eastern Syria, 488 to 515, and from Thomas of Hakel, a subsequent editor, who was likewise a Monophysite, Bishop of Marburg. It is probably the most servile version of Scripture ever made. Scrivener. It is based upon the Peshitta and forces it into rigorous conformity with the letter of the Greek at the expense of the spirit. It dates from AD 508 and was revised by Thomas of Hakel 616. It contains the whole New Testament except the Apocalypse, well, it's probably Revelation, and is therefore more complete than the Peshitta, which omits 4 epistles. Besides, the only edition of the Philoxenian is that of Joseph White, printed by the Clarendon Press, Oxford, 1778 to 1803, 4 volumes, 4to. Bernstein has published the Gospel of John, Leipzig, 1853. And then you have the Curetonian Syriac, which is a mere fragment of the Gospels, consisting of 82.5 leaves, but very old and valuable, though overestimated by Canon Cureton, who thought it retained to a great extent the identical terms and expressions of St. Matthew's Hebrew Gospel. It is regarded by most scholars as Cureton, Payne Smith, Hermanson, Ewald, Crowfoot, Tregellis, and Westcott and Hort as the oldest form of the Syriac version, the Peshitta in its present form holding a relation to it similar to that of the Vulgate to the Old Latin. You have to go do some research on that one. It's probably saying like the Greek Syriac type version, right? Not too sure on that one. Dean Alfred calls it the earliest said most important of all versions. Dr. Scrivener, however, places it decidedly below the Peshitta. It was found by Archdeacon Tatum in 1842, with 550 other manuscripts, in a convent of the Nitrian Desert, 70 miles northwest of Cairo, and brought to the British Museum and was published by Cureton in 1858 with a literal English translation. It agrees remarkably with Codex D and the Old Latin, while the Peshitta mostly favours A. It contains large portions of Matthew, Luke and John and the last 4 verses of Mark. Dr. Brooke, the celebrated Egyptologist, afterwards discovered 3 additional leaves in the binding of a manuscript of the Peshitta, which came from the Nitrian convent 1871. They were published by Rudiger in the Monatsbericht of the Berlin Academy, etc. The Curetonian Syriac, including these new leaves, has been translated into Greek by J.R. Crowfoot in Fragmenta Evangelica, 2 parts, London, 1870 to 71 and 72. D. The Jerusalem Syriac. The principal manuscript known is an Evangelistory in the Vatican, dated AD 1030. This has been published at Verona, 1861-64, 2 volumes, 4to, by Count Francis Miniscalchi Rizzo. Fragments of 2 other manuscripts are in the British Museum, and of 2 more at St. Petersburg. The text of these has been published by Land and Sedota Syriaca, Volume 4, 1875. The version is quite independent of the Peshitta and is referred by Tischendorf to the 5th century. It is in a peculiar dialect and seems to have been little used. Wonder why. Again, you have Latin versions. A. The Old Latin Itala. This version is not found complete, but from the quotations of the Latin fathers, especially those of Tertullian, Cyprian, Lucifer of Cagliari, Hilary of Poitiers, Hilary the Deacon, or Ambrosiaster, Ambrose, etc., and in the Apocalypse Primasius, its text can be in large measure restored. The version is nearest in age to the Peshitta and may be assigned to the middle of the 2nd century. Stop fighting. Hey! Okay, here's some information here. The Latin Vulgate. In the course of time, the text of the Old Latin became so corrupt that a thorough revision was imperative, and was entrusted by Pope Damascus in 382 to Jerome, died 419, the most learned scholar of his day, and of all the Latin fathers best qualified by genius, taste and knowledge of Hebrew and Greek for this difficult task. He began upon the New Testament and proceeded cautiously, making as few changes as possible, so as not to arouse the opposition of those who, as he says, thought that ignorance was holiness. But his scholarly instincts, no less than his convictions of duty towards the divine word, impelled him to go beyond his instructions and make a new version of the Old Testament directly from the Hebrew, of which, however, it does not concern us at present to speak of this particular author. Jerome's revision and new translation, finished 405, encountered much opposition, which greatly irritated his temper and betrayed him into contemptuous abuse of his opponents, whom he styled by Pedus Euselos. But by inherent virtues rather than by external authority, it passed into such current use that in the 8th century it was the Vulgate, the common version in the Western churches. So his translation ended up becoming the Vulgate. It became much corrupted by frequent copying. Alcuin, at the instance of Charlemagne, revised it around 802 by the collation of various good manuscripts, and substantially in this form it passed down into the invention of printing. So it was quite badly corrupted according to this. The first book printed was the Vulgate, the so-called Mazarin Bible, Gutenberg and Fust, Mayence, 1455. Printing, however, fixed errors and gave them wider currency, and revision was felt once more to be imperative. In the Council of Trent, December 13, 1545 to December 4, 1563, the matter was introduced. Feb 4, 1546, and the recommendation of revision passed on April 8th. But it was not until 1590, in the pontificate of Sixtus V, that the revised edition of the Vulgate appeared. So they must have gone all out to fix it, right, to correct it of its errors. The scholarly Pope took active interest in the work, rejecting or confirming the suggestions of the Board of Revisers, or Revisionists, right, and corrected the proof sheets with his own hand. It was prefaced by the famous and, as the event showed, by no means infallible Constitution Aeternus Ille, dated March 1, 1589, in which the Pope said, "By the fullness of apostolic power, we decree and declare that this edition of the Sacred Latin Vulgate of the Old and New Testaments, which has been received as authentic by the Council of Trent, be received and held as true, legitimate, authentic, and unquestioned in all public and private disputation, reading, preaching, and explanation." So up here it says that this Pope took active interest in it, rejecting or confirming the suggestions of the Board of Revisers or Revisionists, and corrected the proof sheets with his own hand. This Pope further forbade any alteration whatever, ordered this text and none other henceforth to be printed. So once he created a proof sheet, that was it. No one could mess with it. He further forbade any alteration whatever, ordered this text and none other henceforth to be printed, and hurled anathemas. It's like not quite curses, but it's like bit of wrath against these guys, these other people, against everyone disobeying the Constitution. But alas for the Pope, the Immaculate Edition was full of errors and blunders, and no sooner was he dead, so it was still full of blunders, right? August 27, 1590, then a demand for a new edition arose. So they had the revisers again, supposedly, we're guessing. Bellarmine suggested an ingenious, though dishonourable, escape from the awkward predicament in which Sixtus had placed the Church. that a corrected edition should be hastily printed under the name of Sixtus, in which the blame of the errors should be thrown upon the printer. So this Pope might have made a mess of it, and they blamed the printer.